Alrighty, let's get things started this afternoon. Kia ora everyone, hello, thank you for coming along. My name's Sylvie, I'm MyHR's Chief Evangelist and I'll be co-host of our webinar today along with my colleague Patrick, who's based in Sydney. Patrick, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for introducing me. Hi everyone, nice to meet everybody.
This is Patrick's first MyHR webinar. He's joining the advisory team over in Sydney. So we will be bouncing back and forth as we cover off content today for New Zealand and for Australia. So when you have questions, if you would like to send them through and just let us know which one of us they're for, we'll make sure that we answer with our New Zealand hat on or with our Australia hat on. So let's kick off. Let's kick off into our content. So first things first, bit of housekeeping today. If you are here for MyHR's Addressing Drugs and Alcohol in the Workplace session, you're in the right place. And if you're not, that's fine. You're welcome to sign off and tap out to go to your next thing. But the first thing to note is that the slides that we're using today and the recording will be available afterwards. So if you'd like to take notes as we go through, you're super welcome to. But if you'd rather just be in the moment and make sure that you are kind of paying attention to the discussion, that's fine as well. If you need to duck away, if your internet bugs out, if you have to jump off and take a call, you can access the recording later. What this does mean is if you would like to ask a question, a copy of it, of course, will be in the webinar recording. So you're welcome to ask a question anonymously. We tend to get most of our questions through anonymously. That's totally fine. Or if Patrick or I see that there is a question which has some identifying details in it, we'll do our best to scrub them before we answer it, just to make sure that everyone's privacy is being taken care of. On that note, questions are very welcome. It's really boring if you listen to me and Patrick talk for an hour. We have some things to say, but not very many things to say sometimes. And so these sessions really come to life when you have questions. We can certainly do our best to answer them. Sometimes we will suggest a question gets taken offline if there's clearly a bit to chew through. And we also had some pre-submitted questions today. So when we get to the end of the webinar, we'll go through the pre-submitted questions and speak to those. We'll also have plenty of time for Q&A as we go through. So ask your questions whenever. If you could let us know if it's an Australian question or a New Zealand question, then the right person will answer, and we'll answer all of them at the end of the session, because it might be that we're covering off stuff that you're asking about as we go through the content today. So who's MyHR and why are we here doing this webinar with you? Well, the first thing to note is we were established in 2013 to make HR easy for small businesses. I've been here 10 years in May, which has flown by. It's a bit of a head spinner to say that number out loud. And we've been here 13 years. We've been doing lots of work in New Zealand, and we're now in Australia and Canada as well. And the easiest way to explain what we do is we are outsourced HR covering all employment matters. So you think about your admin, so your employment agreements and contracts that we're writing. We do about 450 tailored employment agreements a week for our clients in New Zealand. We do performance reviews, onboarding, all of that proactive employee kind of life cycle and process management stuff, through to what I talk about as the pointy end of HR. So your drug and alcohol issues, your serious misconduct, theft, fraud, harassment, 90-day trial period and probation terminations, restructuring, medical incapacity, all of that kind of stuff. So there's not a lot that we haven't seen, and we're here to support small businesses to get the best out of their people and to make sure that their processes and people management are best practice for the resources that small businesses have. The way that we deliver this is a bit unusual. So we've obviously got expert human advisors like myself and Patrick, who are HR people, backed by smart software. So our HR platform is all in one. It's really easy to use, and it's intended to be the bridge between our customers and ourselves. So your HRIS does everything a good HR platform should do. So it stores your documents, it's where your people profiles live, it integrates with your payroll provider, but then you have this whole team of HR people in the back end who are there to help you with the people stuff. We can never do payroll manually. That's what the systems and the software is for. But software and systems can't help you deal with a young person who's having some really difficult troubles at home and is trying to figure out the best way to balance their work obligations and what's happening in their personal life. That's where the human support comes in, and it's where it's our USP compared to our competitors who play in this space. I mentioned earlier we're in New Zealand, Australia, and Canada, which is pretty cool. When I joined, I've told Patrick the story, there were 4 of us, and we all fit around the table at a local Malaysian restaurant, so we were very small. In New Zealand, we're in Auckland and Christchurch, and we've got people working remotely around the country. In Australia, we're in Sydney, and in Canada, we're in Vancouver. They haven't yet sent me on a trip to the ski fields in British Columbia, but I'm hoping maybe next year I can swing one of those to get out that way. In terms of who we work with, it's a real range of businesses. So our smallest employer has 1 employee, and our largest, Resine Paints, has 750. But it's everything in between. We're really oriented to working with businesses in that 20 employees to 100 employee space. That's our sweet spot. And there's no industry that we don't support. So you're thinking mining, retail, accommodation, hospitality, professional services, manufacturing, small family businesses through to kind of larger partnerships or larger entities, not-for-profits. We do a lot of work in this space. It means that there isn't a lot that we haven't seen. And when you're staring down the barrel of a non-negative test for one of your employees, pulling your hair out because you've never dealt with this before, that's where our team are there to add the value, because there's not a lot that we haven't touched on before, and MyHR usually knows what to do when it comes to your people. In terms of cost, just the last point here, we're a subscription-based model. So you'll pay per person in your account. If your business grows, your costs increase a bit. If your business shrinks, your costs decrease. But it means that we can be a really effective fence at the top of the cliff, because you can call us as much as you want and your billing doesn't change. If you're worried about every invoice you're going to get that itemizes your conversations per 6 minutes, it makes it a lot harder for small business to access support. So that subscription-based model, again, really is around getting people to contact us so we can help before things go south and we have to be the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, which is more expensive and more time consuming for everyone. So what are we talking about today in terms of what we can expect? The first thing we'll do is go over the basics in terms of health and safety. We'll talk about company policies, and we'll talk about impairment, which is what we really care about in the drugs and alcohol space, and a bit of a comment on alcohol at work, because who hasn't had a beer with their colleagues on a Friday afternoon, but it is something that we have to talk about. We'll then get into the meat of today's conversation around drug and alcohol testing. So when is it appropriate and when is it not appropriate? How do you manage non-compliance? What are we doing about prescription medications, particularly medicinal cannabis, which is legal in New Zealand and sort of varies across Australia. We'll spend some time looking at real world examples, and like I flagged earlier, plenty of time for questions. So again, if this isn't what you're expecting, this is your chance to duck out. But assuming you're in the right webinar today, let's kick into things. So the basics. We'll start with why we care about drugs and alcohol at work. It seems obvious, but sometimes it's worth restating that we have health and safety obligations to anyone that we cross paths with kind of in the course of doing business. Obviously, that's our employees. It's anyone who comes to site. It's obviously anyone who our work impacts. So if we're working in public spaces, it's pedestrians, it's people driving around the area. We have to make sure that we're minimizing any risks to people's health and well-being across all of those different spaces, which includes drug and alcohol. In New Zealand, this is governed by the Health and Safety at Work Act. In Australia, it's the Work Health and Safety Act. We're just rearranging those words to make sure we're different to our Australian and New Zealand cousins, but very, very similarly titled legislation there. And obviously, intoxication presents really serious risks. So obviously, to the intoxicated person, they can harm themselves if they trip or if they stumble and skin a knee or sprain a wrist at the short end of things. If they're driving machinery, if they're operating heavy equipment, obviously that risk scales up. And then, of course, there are the risks to others affected by their actions. So hurting other people is terrible. Putting ourselves at risk is also something that we don't want to be managing. Members of the public with who we cross paths. There's obviously all sorts of kind of physical kind of harm concerns here and mental harm pieces. That all comes first, as it should. Secondly, we're concerned about financial consequences here. So if people are injured at work or hurt themselves in the course of their jobs, that can cause costs in terms of a rise of ACC levies. You're managing this person's sick leave. They may be off work for a period of time, forbid that they've hurt someone else. You're obviously managing their health and their rehabilitation. And in New Zealand, if you're prosecuted under the Health and Safety at Work Act, there are also some penalties there, including ultimately prison time if, as a director of the company, you were aware of health and safety risks and didn't do anything to manage them. So I found myself saying obviously there a few times. I don't think this is new to anyone, but Patrick, was there anything you wanted to add there in terms of the risks from an Australian perspective?
Yeah, look, from an Australian perspective, it's quite similar in all honesty. You're not looking at jail time per se, but the fines are quite large, for instance. Obviously, WorkSafe do come out and they will audit, for instance. And, when it gets to that point, you're at a point where you could possibly get on the spot fines, etc. So essentially the same, it's basically the same thing, for instance, for Australia.
And I think this is one of the areas where New Zealand and Australia focuses in legislation are quite similar. So I really appreciate you being here because I don't have any Australian experience to speak to. I'm really pleased to have your expertise in the room. So thank you again. Well, look,
Absolutely happy to be here.
let's jump on through then and talk specifically around why we care about drugs and alcohol at work. Oh, sorry, let's talk about the policies piece. So this is sometimes what people think of as the boring stuff, talking about crazy stories where people have done stuff that's really wild is one thing, but kind of seeing people's eyes glaze over when we talk about policies is entirely another. So what we need to be aware of here is that policies are documents that explain how we do things around here. They can be quite dry, they can be quite prescriptive, but they're really important as guardrails that kind of manage how people do things at work and how people behave. They also, importantly, set expectations regarding intoxication at work and how breaches of policy will be managed. So just because something's written down in a policy and someone's signed it in a blitz of onboarding kind of admin, certainly doesn't mean they'll always hold themselves to that standard. But if you don't have anything written down, it's really hard later to say that someone should have known what was expected of them. A policy document isn't your only tool in your arsenal to keep people's behaviour kind of safe and within the bounds of what's appropriate, but it certainly is a really important one, and we'll spend some time talking about that a bit later. So what I would like New Zealand businesses in particular to be aware of, and it's the same in Australia, is you do have some ability to drug and alcohol test based on your general health and safety obligations. So if you don't have a health and safety policy in place, or if you don't have a specific drug and alcohol guideline in place, that doesn't mean you definitely won't be able to test your employees. You will in some circumstances. So I'm just flagging again, in New Zealand, the Health and Safety at Work Act, in Australia, the Work Health and Safety Act, means that you can test if it's a post-incident, so if someone's crashed a company car or if there's been some other kind of accident at work, if you've got reasonable cause to suggest someone might be intoxicated at work, so slurring, stumbling, bloodshot eyes, being really forgetful and absent-minded, perhaps they're snacking a lot, or they might be smelling of tequila or whiskey or something. If you've got reasonable cause, you can test in those circumstances. And also if there are other stakeholders in your operation who have drug and alcohol testing requirements. So typically in the construction world, this is subcontractors going to other company sites and working there. Often there'll be kind of a broader health and safety ecosystem that operates over that entire site, and so your team might have to be drug and alcohol tested as part of the other company's requirements. In those circumstances, you're following their policy. You don't need your own in place to be running the testing, but broadly, I would suggest it is best to have a policy in place, not only to kind of meet those guardrail pieces earlier to set expectations around what is acceptable at work, but in New Zealand, it's required if you want to have random drug testing of your employees. We'll spend some time talking about this, so if you have any questions, feel free to pop them through, but I do just want to flag that if you want to do any kind of random testing in New Zealand, you do have to have a drug and alcohol policy in place. I've just had a couple of questions come through. I'm just going to check to see if it's anything critical about the recording. No, they are just questions. That's fine. I will we'll come back to them when we get to that part of the session today. Cool. So let's talk about impairment and drug and alcohol testing, because they're not quite the same thing, and these nuances matter when it comes to talking about what we can do when someone shows up at work and they might be intoxicated. So we care about impairment in the drug and alcohol context. We don't care about people's consumption necessarily. That's what happens in their private life. But what we care about is the intersection and the overlap with work. But how do you test for impairment, right? How do you test if someone's judgment is impacted by the cannabis they smoked on the weekend? How do you test if their distance is going to be affected by the mimosa they had for breakfast that morning? It can be quite tricky. Impairment tests do exist. They're things like a responsiveness test, where you get someone to click and follow around a flashing light on a screen, and if they're slow or if they keep missing it, that's an indication they might be impaired. And there are things like balance tests, kind of the classic, please get out of your vehicle and walk in a straight line, ma'am, would be some examples of impairment tests. The trick is it can be difficult to prove what that's related to. If someone has a condition like epilepsy, a responsiveness test is going to be quite dangerous for them. If they're taking other medication which is prescribed but not illicit that's slowing them down, sometimes people who have nervous system issues can have troubles with their balance. So impairment itself doesn't indicate that drugs and alcohol were consumed. And so how do we get to the kind of drug and alcohol question? And the answer is that testing for intoxicating substances substances is where we land. So we have a range of methods here. I'm sure most of us will have done a breath test if we drive when we're passing through a police checkpoint. There are also urine, saliva, and blood tests. The most common one that I've seen in a workplace would be a urine test. It's pretty well established. It's much more effective than saliva. It captures a wider range of substances. And blood tests tend to be more complicated to administer. You need a phlebotomist who has kind of certain qualifications. And breath testing, again, kind of doesn't capture as many things as a urine test does. Patrick, did you have anything to add here in terms of what you see in Australia? Is it the same? Are urine tests the most common?
Urine tests are quite common. I generally find it's a swab. Usually it's saliva, in all honesty. Of course, we generally get third parties to come out and actually get the swab, get the actual test done themselves, and that's generally everything else is pretty much the same.
Nice. And critically, we'll talk about this too, but both Patrick and I would recommend getting a third-party provider to do your testing, whether that's a one-off because you've got reason to suspect someone might be drunk at work, or whether it's a part of a random testing regime. Getting a third party to do it can be much more defensible because you can say that they don't if you and Susan had a blow up a couple of weeks ago and now she's failed a random drug test and she accuses you of faking her result because you're still grumpy about the way that she called you out in that meeting, a third party provider has none of that conflict of interest. And also maintaining in-house kind of testing credentials and resourcing can be really difficult for small businesses. So a third party is often the way to go, we find. Cool. The other piece here is it's really easily quantifiable. Judging how bad someone's balance is can be a little bit tricky unless you've got a gyroscope attached to them. But when we're looking at urine testing, saliva testing, and so on, you can really easily measure the amounts of these substances we're finding in people's system. That doesn't always equal intoxication. Someone who's, 6'5" and weighs 140 kilos is going to have a really different tolerance to alcohol than someone who's 5'2" and weighs 50 kilos kind of soaking wet. So not always an exact one-for-one in terms of intoxication, but we can show that these substances are there, which leads to kind of on the balance of probabilities saying that they were intoxicated at work or after the incident, whatever it is that we're looking at. They also identify a range of substances. So if you do a test, it'll show up for things like methamphetamines, for alcohol, for THC, which is the intoxicating component of cannabinoids. So there's a bunch of different stuff that shows up in these tests, which are quite useful. They tend to be quite wide spectrum. There are some drawbacks, though, as with every single thing we talk about in the employment world. And the first is that these tests need to be done promptly. Alcohol, as we know, gets processed at about the rate of 1 standard drink per hour, depending on whether you're male or female and kind of your body weight and size. And so if someone shows up to work slurring and stumbling their words at 9 a.m. and then you can't get a test for them until 4 p.m. or until the day after, it's likely that their body already would have processed the alcohol. And so you're going to get a negative test result, even though the behavior that you were seeing definitely was concerning and justified the test. So they need to be done quite promptly. And like I flagged earlier, it can be tricky to accurately judge impairment. There's kind of a reasonableness test as well as some established cutoffs. So when you're thinking about how you use drug and alcohol testing at work, if you do or if you don't, have a think about what you're going to do if you do get a non-negative result and whether you're going to just have some cutoffs in place or what other guardrails you're going to have in place to assess impairment. But wait, what about privacy? I hear some people saying, and especially if we have had employees jump on this call, which hopefully is clearly intended for employers to be managing. The privacy question, I think, is a genuine one. I quite enjoy a glass of wine on the weekend, so I kind of don't want that to be showing up in my employment world and being a mark on my record. But there is an undeniable intersection here between the personal and then kind of the professional, on the other hand. So employees are absolutely entitled to to privacy in their personal lives. But in New Zealand speak, they must be really willing and able to work. And we obviously have health and safety obligations to manage risk of harm to themselves and to other people. And so employers end up with a bit of a mandate to manage this aspect of personal behaviour if it impacts the workplace. Just to reiterate again, we don't necessarily care about consumption, we care about impairment. If you get really blazed on Saturday night, your body processes the cannabis over the weekend, you show up to Monday kind of really willing to work, it's sort of not your boss's job to care about what happened 2 days ago because you won't be impaired to work on Monday. So the consumption isn't the problem, the impairment is the problem, and that's what we're trying to manage here. Now, Patrick and I talked about this and decided we needed to specifically call out alcohol in the workplace, especially in our Australian and New Zealand work and drinking cultures. We would be a bit remiss to have a drug and alcohol webinar without talking about alcohol in the workplace. So the first call out is that your usual health and safety obligations and behavioural standards apply to any work associated event. If that's a client lunch offsite on a Thursday, if it's a Christmas party, in Auckland, we might go to Waiheke Island and do something in a vineyard over there. It might just be drinks after work on a Friday, kind of in the office. If it's a work-associated event, your usual health and safety obligations apply, as well as kind of some general obligations around keeping people safe. So, a bit of a checklist for you. The first thing to do before you serve alcohol at work, doesn't have to be every week if you're having drinks every Friday, maybe every 6 to 12 months would be a sensible cadence, is to check your drug and alcohol policy. Do you have one? If you're serving alcohol at work or facilitating access to alcohol by having an event at a restaurant or a bar where there's alcohol served, I would really strongly recommend you have a DNA policy in place. Make sure there are some boundaries around alcohol consumption. It's clear what's going to happen, be clear what consequences are if there are breaches of the policy. And if needed, have people review it or have people re-sign the agreement if they haven't for a few years. Especially with your new starters, make sure this is a part of their kind of onboarding bundle. Obviously, you can manage that through MyHR if you're a client, but just check your paperwork's in order. Sometimes there's nothing you'll need to change. Sometimes there might be things you choose to update, but do just make sure that this is all go. And then set expectations beforehand. Like you are a primary school teacher managing a gaggle of children about to go on a fun kind of day out with the museum, have a meeting beforehand to make sure everyone's clear on what's expected. It feels really nerdy. It feels really sterile. It can feel a bit stank if you're everyone's getting jazzed up, and if it's Christmas, people might be getting dressed up to go out and have a lovely time. But make sure that you are setting these expectations beforehand. One, hopefully to genuinely try and keep everyone safe. But if things do go a bit haywire or things do go a bit skew-iff during the event, later on, the fact that you set expectations here means if you need to, you can hold people to account for their poor behaviour during the party. So this might be a team meeting where you say, hey, everyone, I've got to do the mum thing here and just remind you all that we're consuming alcohol, so we have to be responsible. There are ways you can make it fun and a bit less kind of dorky where you need to. Explain what happens if someone does drink too much. Will you cut them off? Will you send them home? Who's going to be making that judgment call? Just be clear around what's going to happen there, and remind people that this is a work event. We might all be friendly, we might all be having a good time together, but if you are treating people or talking about things or cracking jokes that you wouldn't at 11 a.m. on a Tuesday in the cold, hard light of day, you might want to be having a think about whether that's going to be appropriate for this Christmas party. And then, of course, make sure you are a responsible host. So serve water, food, make sure there are non-alcoholic beverages there. More and more people, especially of the younger generations, of which I am no longer part, are choosing to be sober or not to consume as much for a huge variety of personal reasons. So make sure you've got a range of non-alcoholic beverages available. And consider vouchers instead of an open bar. We had a client about 3 or 4 years ago who did a super, super lavish Christmas party. They paid for an open bar. They'd had an absolutely stellar year. Life was going really well for them. And it was the Christmas party where they had had the most complaints and the most kind of post-Christmas party wash up. People were just thrilled with the year that they'd had. Everyone was getting together. They had a few different sites. People were hanging out with their mates from different offices. It was meant to be a really fun celebration. It became like a really kind of bummer January where they were having to mop up and have some really uncomfortable conversations with a few people, and one of their employees was let go. The year following, they switched to using vouchers instead of an open bar. They had a slightly less lavish Christmas party, wasn't as big a year to celebrate, but giving everyone kind of 3 tokens to go and get a drink meant that everyone could still have a good time. They get a glass of champagne, get a wine with dinner, get a beer afterwards. But it meant that for people who either weren't used to kind of judging their alcohol intake, sometimes younger people or people who don't drink very often, it meant that they could just kind of manage things and keep things to a slightly less raucous environment, and that worked out really well for them. So it can feel a bit stink kind of handing over your admit one theme park voucher for a glass of wine, but it is one of the ways just to keep a lid on how much alcohol people might consume, and also means you can predict your costs a bit better rather than having an open bar. At the event itself, I would suggest having a couple of sober seniors. As an HR person, often that role falls to us. Hey, Patrick, that's something we've had to do during the years. But whether it's
Absolutely.
the CEO, the ops manager, someone in the senior team, just to kind of stay sober and keep an eye on things. Doesn't mean they can't have a glass of champagne when they first arrive, but just make sure that they are supported to keep an eye on how things are going, and cut people off before they're intoxicated. If you can see someone having a really good time and kind of heading in that direction, again, be the fence at the top of the cliff rather than the ambulance at the bottom. If you can see them heading that way, have a quiet word with them, grab them an orange juice and just give them a breather before their next drink. You might not have to cut them off entirely, but certainly you want to make sure that you are supporting them to stay sober at this event. And lastly, do ensure safe transport home. This might be taxis or Ubers or lifts from the venue to home. This could be if people have parked it off at the office and then carpooled or taken a shuttle to the event. It would be a shuttle or carpools back to the office and people can make their way home from there. But if you are taking people offsite, make sure they have safe transport home as one of your pretty clear employee obligations. So let's jump into testing itself and talk about when it's appropriate, when it isn't, and then of course how we manage non-compliance. So testing is appropriate in a few different circumstances that we'll go through. The first is pre-employment, especially in roles where they're safety sensitive. So again, you're working with equipment, you're working with tools, you might be working at heights, but there are additional hazards or risks to your well-being that being intoxicated would hurt. They often show up in the pre-employment world as a kind of drug and alcohol screen before you get the job. Post-incident testing, I flagged earlier, if there's been a car crash or if something's happened, often people who are involved in the incident, even if there's no reason to think that they were under the effects of alcohol or drugs at work, it's just kind of part of your post-incident routine to make sure none of that was at play, to show that you're managing the risks here. Reasonable cause, Sylvie's stumbling, she's slurring, it looks a bit roughed up. Her makeup might be smeared down her face and her mascara is like painting kind of all down her cheeks and things. Anything that makes you believe that someone might be under the effects of illicit substances is reasonable cause. Random testing is a funny one, and we will talk about this a little bit later, but random testing is appropriate when you have a workforce who are in safety sensitive roles and you want to keep a check on things to make sure that drugs and alcohol aren't at play. It's not appropriate when there is one person you're concerned about. That would be a more targeted testing that you'd need to do, possibly with some reasonable cause. But where you have, you're overseeing a factory, you've got 20 production operators who are working with kind of fast-moving heavy machinery, and if they were intoxicated at work, the hazards are pretty major. You might choose to do some random testing every 3 to 4 months just to make sure that you're staying on top of things and that your team are aware that they will be tested randomly at work, just to make sure that they're sober when they come to work. Stakeholder requirements we've talked about. So if there's a customer or a provider or a site that you're working at where there is a requirement to do the testing, that's all cool. And sometimes they show up as part of a return to work plan. So I see this less commonly, and Patrick, I'll ask for your views in a second. Providing rehabilitation support to someone who has said, I have an issue or a problem with drug or alcohol abuse, and I want to go away and get some treatment for it and come back to work. As part of that, you might choose to support them in their return to work. And as part of that, you might choose to do kind of regularly scheduled testing to make sure that they are keeping to their treatment plan and staying sober at work. In the small and medium business world, we often, frankly, don't have the resources to provide this kind of support and care to our staff. So I don't see this as commonly, but certainly for larger employers, or if it's something that you feel strongly about as a business owner, it might be something that you see. Patrick, where does this come up in your world? Do you see much of this?
Yes, I've actually dealt with this a few times. So, because I've dealt with quite a few sectors, for instance, the road transport sector, I find that unfortunately there are quite a few drivers that might take certain substances to make sure that they can get their trip done, right? So this is a common sort of thing in that sector, right? And where we do see that an employee may have a substance issue, essentially what we could do is let them have a period of leave, right? We've done that in the past. Even if it was a small business, it's generally dependent on how much the employer sort of wants to keep that employee on, right? After that, essentially, it's like you said, a bit of a plan where essentially we're going to test the employee consistently, could be week by week, and try and get them back on that track. It does depend, of course, right? I have seen other instances where it's alcohol and an employee has lost their license and they've chosen, for instance, to work out a situation where the employee is on a period of leave.
Nice, thank you. And then let's jump in to talking about when testing is not appropriate, of course. So the first thing to do is acknowledge that random testing for non-safety sensitive roles is usually not going to pass that privacy test. If your employees work in an office, maybe they work as a barista, perhaps they anything that they're not dealing with cars or machinery or working at heights, if the jobs aren't safety sensitive, it will be almost impossible in New Zealand for you to justify a random testing regime, because it's not clear that there are such significant risks at work that would justify the invasion of privacy that random testing brings to the world. So if you have someone who you're concerned might be dealing with a substance abuse problem or is repeatedly showing up to work in a way that suggests that they might be impaired, we can totally tackle that. Let's have a conversation about some reasonable cause testing to understand what's going on with them. Sometimes it just starts with a conversation. But often when clients ask me about this, it's because they have a particular one person they're worried about, but they don't know how to address it with them. So they go, oh, well, let's randomly test the office, and coincidentally, this person just happens to get pulled up on the random testing roster. And so that'll give us our in to kind of talk about it. That's not appropriate. It won't stand up if challenged. You're invading the privacy of a bunch of other people who have done nothing wrong because you have concerns about this one person. So random testing for non-safety sensitive roles generally it's not something that we recommend. It can also be really difficult to test without a drug and alcohol policy in place. I flagged earlier that you do have some ability to use tests as a health and safety tool under the Health and Safety at Work Act. Again, reasonable cause post-incident if you've got kind of stakeholder requirements. But if you want to introduce random testing in particular, it's really tricky. And also in terms of managing the consequences, what happens if you do get a non-negative? How do you handle that? Is there a disciplinary that might be in place? Does this person get suspended from work? There are a whole bunch of questions that testing throws up that if you haven't outlined the answers to those questions in a policy, the employment relations kind of judges and decision-making bodies in New Zealand are going to look pretty closely at what you're doing to make sure that it's reasonable. And generally without good reason. If you are a teetotaler and you have given up alcohol because it had an awful effect on your life or a family member, and so you want every single person you employ not to drink alcohol, that's probably not something you can enforce. You have made a personal decision that is totally right for you and totally right for your family, but you probably won't be able to enforce your own standards on kind of people who come to work for you unless you have good health and safety reason. So whatever your personal preferences are, whether you think alcohol is a terrible substance and should be banned, whether you have really strong feelings about kind of use of illicit substances like LSD or cannabis or anything else that you can get on the black market, if you don't have a good reason to test your employees, you won't be able to get it across the line. I'm sorry. So what happens when there is a test? Let's go through it in some detail. So whether it's as a result of random testing or you've done a targeted kind of reasonable cause test because Patrick shows up and he's jittery and he can't stop talking and his jaw's working all the time, you think he might be on something a bit peculiar, you've collected a sample from this person. We talked before in New Zealand, urine's quite common. In Australia, it sounds like a swab with saliva is more common. There will be an on-site check, and this check is a pretty basic one, and it will throw up a negative result. There are no substances of concern here, or it will say a non-negative result. There is a substance here, whether it's alcohol, whether it's methamphetamine, whether it's ecstasy, can't tell, but I can tell you there's something in here. If it's non-negative, that sample gets sent off-site to a lab for additional testing. Depending on the capacity of the testing provider, that can honestly be sometimes less than a 24-hour turnaround time, sometimes a bit longer, but the samples themselves are pretty quick to process, but you need testing equipment that's more sophisticated than can happen kind of on-site. So a lab report, like it's a PDF, gets generated and will be sent to the employer, and that goes into a lot more detail than the non-negative result is. So it will list the substances. It will say alcohol or THC or CBD or cannabinoids, not CBD, but whatever the issue is, and then the amounts present in the sample. So you can get a pretty accurate picture of what's happened, kind of the person's consumption, whether those levels are likely to be at the levels for intoxication, and then decide what happens there in terms of next steps in the test process. So if you're thinking about introducing testing at work, which is a conversation we have pretty frequently with our clients, there is a bit of groundwork to lay in New Zealand. So we'll talk about what happens in New Zealand, and then I'll hand to Patrick for his very thorough, very detailed explanation of what happens in Australia. So first thing to know is that you do need your team's input before you do this. Consultation isn't agreement. They might not agree with you doing this and they might want to push back, but a consultation process is required and you do need to give them a chance to give you their feedback. So provide your staff with your draft policy, explain why you want to introduce testing. Has something happened? Is there an industry kind of norm that's changing? Are you working with a new supplier and there's new hazards in the way that you're kind of shipping your product to them? Whatever it might be, provide the rationale behind it and go through it in a bit of detail. Give them some time to read the policy and provide you with comments, right? So kind of 2 to 5 business days, and give them time to read the policy and then provide you, oh, sorry, I've just said that, give you, I was checking the time and I missed where I was, sorry team, and give you with any feedback they have. Generally 2 to 5 business days is reasonable. Anything up to 2 weeks if it's a really complicated policy or you have lots and lots of people to go through, but a few business days is typically pretty standard. Often these policies aren't complicated, they're just a mechanism for getting that testing in place. Listen to people's feedback, answer questions. Again, you don't have to get them to agree with you, you just have to give them a chance to give you feedback and then to hear what they have to say. Once you've done that, you can make a decision about whether you do or don't introduce drug and alcohol testing at work. So that's New Zealand. Patrick, I'll hand over for Australia. Just give me a hand up when you want your next point.
Okie dokie. Yeah. So I hope you guys are ready for this really long explanation. So if we just click on the next one. A memo. So that's what we're going to do essentially. So look, in Australia, it's a lot easier in the sense where we don't have to consult. We don't have to meet with each employee, for instance. We could simply put out a memorandum, right, changing our company policies and procedures. Because the handbook is not obviously bound, for instance, to the employee's contract or etc. We actually have the ability to change those policies and procedures as we kind of see fit. Now, to implement a drug and alcohol testing at work, essentially it could be as simple as a memo, right? That doesn't mean it's always best practice. You could absolutely consult. We could go more so the New Zealand process, right? This way we get an understanding, for instance, of how our employees feel about the policy. But of course, it could be just as quick as a memo.
I can imagine a lot of New Zealand employers are shaking their heads in frustration at the New Zealand framework in this one and looking at Australia with a bit of envy. I don't blame you. I would just reassure you, consultation doesn't mean you have to get everyone on board. It can just be as simple as hearing their feedback, but yeah, slightly different to the regime in Australia. Hey? Cool. So let's talk about managing non-compliance and a couple of differences here between us and Australia. So I'll give Patrick a moment to talk about this in a second. But what happens next? You have someone who has failed a test. Maybe they've shown up to work slurring, they're stumbling, they kind of can't grip things and their balance is all over the show. In that case, it would be a reasonable cause test where you're going, I'm really concerned that you are intoxicated and not fit to do your job. We're asking you to submit to a drug and alcohol test. Or you've had a non-negative test result. Maybe it's through random testing, maybe it's post-incident. Something has happened, there's been a test and now you've got this non-negative test result. In New Zealand, what we need to do is propose suspension from work on pay while the test is processed and sent to the lab. And then if we decide that this person staying away from work is appropriate while we kind of manage the next steps of the process, that suspension might continue. So again, proposing suspension doesn't mean that you need to get the employee to agree with you. You're just giving them a chance to comment on the proposed suspension. Where there's been a non-negative drug and alcohol test, often people don't have much to say. It's pretty obvious why you're asking to remove them from the workplace. Sometimes people push back. That's fine. Just hear out what they have to say and then move things along. Make sure they've got safe transport home. If they drove themselves here, you'll need to arrange alternative transport. That could be having another of your team drop them off. It could be making sure there's a way they can get home with public transport. Again, it might be organising a taxi or an Uber, or you could get a family member to come and get them. But make sure they've got a way to get home safe. And then consider what happens next. Are there some disciplinary consequences here? Was there is the issue of them being intoxicated at work so severe that you need to go to dismissal because it's significantly undermined your trust and confidence in them as an employee? If they are in a safety sensitive role, most of the time this is where this will land. If they're not in a safety sensitive role, you have a little bit more flexibility in terms of what you decide happens next. It'll probably be a misconduct issue, but whether it amounts to serious misconduct kind of depends on the facts of the case. But then if you decide they are able to come back to work, you trust them not to do it again while you work through the disciplinary process, maybe you find alternative duties, or if you don't trust them, you may need to find some alternative duties here. But again, it's hugely dependent on the circumstances, and that's where the human support with MyHR comes in, and we can help you navigate this kind of as it comes through. So then, Patrick, I'll hand over to you here because there's a slightly different piece on the suspension thing that I'll let you talk through.
Yeah, absolutely. So things are pretty similar when it comes to, I guess, what we would do, what would happen next. Of course, reasonable cause test if they are slurring, for instance, stumbling, smelling of booze. If you've had a non-negative test result right now, there is the opportunity, for instance, to suspend the employee. We can send them home. Of course, we want to send them home with safe transport, of course, but we want to make sure, for instance, that they are paid. There's only one real way that we can send an employee home without pay, and that's under stand down under Section 524 in the Fair Work Act. Right now, that focuses mainly on major events, for instance, like freak of nature, things that are outside of the employee and the employer's control. Unfortunately, this doesn't actually consist, or it doesn't sort of meet the regulations there. So we can absolutely propose suspension from work, right? It does have to be on pay while the test is processed and sent to the lab. So generally, we are suspending them for the investigation period, right? Like we said, we'd ensure safe transport home and then consider what happens next. So now, generally speaking, if we've done this correct, if we've tested for a position that's obviously got a lot to do with health and safety aspect in terms of like maybe it's a forklift driver, then it's most likely going to be serious misconduct. It's most likely going to meet the regulations for imminent risk to the health and safety of another employee or themselves. So now we could look at whether it's going to be a final warning, a dismissal, or for instance, we're planning to rehabilitate them and get them back in the workplace.
Super thorough. Thank you, Patrick. Well, let's jump now to talking about prescription medication, which of course includes cannabis. This has been a new law change, certainly in New Zealand over the last decade or so. Having cannabis available on prescriptions is reasonably new, and there's some concerns, certainly from the employers that we support, as to how this impacts their ability to keep people safe at work. So broadly, regardless of what the medication is, employees will need to disclose it to you if they're taking a medication which might affect them at work. This could be increased drowsiness, this could be fatigue or increased anxiety as a side effect of the medication. Perhaps it changes the frequency with which they need to eat or use the bathroom, whatever the issue is. We do need to make sure that we are supporting our team and making sure that they have what they need to be safe at work. I've just had the alert that my battery is about to die, so excuse me while I faff around and find the charger. Regardless of whether it's cannabis, whether it's any other kind of prescription, your employees will need to tell you. So sort of that's the broad rule. And then depending on what the side effects of the medication are, you'll need to make reasonable accommodations where it's practical for you to do so. This might be giving them a few more breaks during the day so they can manage their insulin injection if that's what's going on, or they can take more breaks if there's kind of an anxiety piece. If it's reasonable and practical, go ahead and do so. But if you're unable to accommodate these changes, have a conversation as to whether there are alternative duties in the business they could take up, or perhaps a totally different role. If they were working as a forklift driver, but the new medication makes them drowsy or means that they have a limitation on how long they can spend working with heavy machinery, have a look and see if there are any back office duties that they can take up instead, for example. Ultimately, if there are no alternative duties or no other job they could do, it might be a conversation around termination. And this is the same with medicinal cannabis. There are many, many, many products out there that have very different levels of CBD and THC, which is the intoxicating component of cannabis. So CBD is undetectable in a drug test, just a heads up. If cannabis does show up in a drug test, it is the intoxicating bit of the cannabis plant. But decide what your threshold is here. If you have jobs where maybe this wouldn't be a concern, have a think about whether those would be suitable for someone who is taking medicinal cannabis, but include it in your DNA policy. What is your stance here? How would you be managing things? So broadly, you don't have to, because it's medicinal, doesn't give someone a free pass to be as baked as they want to be at work. You do need to be managing this risk to their health and well-being and to other people's, just like you would if it was any other prescription medication. And then in Australia, Patrick, there's a piece here around a couple of different pathways to dismissal. Is that right?
Yeah, there is essentially. So you could go something like a show cause, essentially, which is you're basically asking the employee to show cause as to how they plan to fulfill their inherent requirements of their role, considering what's happened, right? They might have shown that they've been intoxicated with THC, right? They might be, again, a forklift driver. We could essentially show cause and terminate them that way. Now, there's other instances, for instance, capabilities dismissal, right? Now, that's generally a lot longer of a process, right? You'd have to wait about 3 months for them to be impaired, unable to work, for instance, and for them to not have sick leave. Now, if, of course, that is the case, we can continue down that pathway of sort of similar to show cause, really showing that the employee doesn't have the capability or the inherent capability, to actually work and do their role. And that's one of the more common practices.
Nice. Thank you for that detail. Well, and look, we are taking a little bit more time to get through our content today, so I will jump through these real world scenarios because we will, I'm sure, talk about aspects of them when we get to questions. But the final thing I'll do before we jump into questions is just look at how MyHR can help with a couple of these pieces here. So the first thing that we can do is we can write your drug and alcohol policy with you. Cody Ridge Lodge and Tours is a demo account. I promise I'm not showing an actual client's policy. We're not that kind of HR person. But we can write this policy with you if you're testing, if you do offer rehabilitation or you don't. We'll make sure all of that's included in there. And then on your employee's profile, you can obviously take notes. So if someone has failed a test, if you're observing a pattern of behavior where they're continually coming into work a bit hungover and looking a bit kind of shabby, take notes. We can then jump in and help figure out kind of what the pathway is for next steps. You've then got the Ask Us function. So this is a 3 business hour turnaround time. If you've got a quick question or you want to jump in and understand what your options are, this is your place to get in touch with your HR team. You can also call us. Patrick and I are not fantastic quality kind of AI agents. We're real people and the team is the same. So if you'd just like to understand what your choices are, give us a call. And we can also, if need be, write your record of discussion, your performance improvement plan, or your disciplinary letter with you. And once we've kicked off a process, we can then guide you through what happens next and manage any feedback that comes in. So a few of the ways MyHR can help and be useful in these circumstances. And now, with no further ado, let's jump into questions. So these are a couple of pre-submitted ones. If you do have questions for us, jump in and submit them now. Patrick, I've got a bit of time after 2 p.m. New Zealand time, so I can stick around. Are you the same, or do you have a hard stop?
Yeah, no, I've got plenty of time.
Cool. Flick your questions through. We'll work through them as we go. To give you a bit of breathing space to write your question down, we'll work through our pre-submitted ones and then jump into ones that are coming through live. So question number 1, when can we legally ask an employee to take a drug test? And do we need to random test all our employees if we suspect one employee of using illegal substances? Patrick, maybe I'll take this one and flip the next one to you. How does that sound?
No worries.
So you can legally ask an employee to take a drug test for those kind of 6 circumstances I flagged earlier. In this case, it would be a reasonable cause one. It sounds like you have one particular person who's giving you some cause for concern. What is the reason for your concern? Have you seen them drinking out of a hip flask during their lunch break? That's a pretty obvious kind of trigger for a reasonable cause test. Are there other behavioural indicators that are concerning to you? Are they coming with bloodshot eyes? Are they slurring and being forgetful and dropping things and tripping over their own feet? Have a look at the set of behaviours that are giving you cause for concern. And then I would suggest getting some legal advice about whether that's enough for a reasonable cause test. I think kind of a cluster of those behaviours usually is. And as I flagged earlier, we don't recommend random testing if you suspect one person of having a drug problem. Deal with the actual problem in front of you, which is one person's behaviour is giving rise to concern, and either have a conversation with them, jump into a reasonable cause drug test, and take things from there. So next question, and Patrick, this is one for you. Any comments on how to navigate staff who are taking medicinal cannabis?
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to navigating staff on that are taking medical cannabis, it's really important, like Sylvie mentioned earlier, to try and distinct whether or not there is that impairment factor, right? So as we mentioned, CBD, there is no real, there is no impairment factor. Essentially, you could drive on that. It's mainly for your pain, for instance. In some cases, it might be for mood. It's really dependent on why the employee is using it, and whether or not, like Sylvie said, it's going to impair them. So yeah, look, it's mainly whether or not they are using the THC function of cannabis, right? Of course, if they're driving, right, if they have any kind of machinery, heavy machinery, I tend to find that this is something that happens in the construction sector, unfortunately. Then it's going to be an issue, of course, right? That's going to create a massive risk, for instance, to the imminent safety of your employees. And if that's the case, then it's essentially, if it is one person, well, of course, we can go through reasonable cause. If we can smell it, if we can sort of see that they have red eyes, and follow the disciplinary procedure from there.
Perfect. Thank you, Patrick. And then jumping to our next pre-submitted one before jumping to our quite a few live questions coming through, as you would expect with this topic. So this one here, how do you address someone having a single beer every morning once they arrive at work? We stock beers for Fridays, but the beers are being drunk outside of this weekly event, despite clear messaging that they are not to be consumed at other times. So my view is you immediately pull that person aside and have a conversation with them to say, hey, we've observed that you are frequently having a can from the fridge that's stocked for beers kind of after work on Fridays. This behavior is not acceptable. I know that it's been ongoing for a while, but we are drawing a line in the sand to say that this is not okay going forward. If we observe this happening again, we will consider whether disciplinary action is appropriate. We've been really clear with our communications that these are for after work drinks. Having alcohol in the morning is not appropriate. It's not a message that we want to send to the rest of our team that this behaviour is okay. So if it happens again, I'm letting you know that there might be some disciplinary action in your future. That can feel quite harsh. You could step it back and have a private conversation again to say, hey, I just want to remind you that this isn't okay, and what are you doing having a beer at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday? My concern about that softer approach is that if this person was going to stop, they already would have. And the fact that they think it is in any way acceptable to have a drink at 9 o'clock in the morning it gives me concern that this behaviour is going to continue, that there is a pattern here that won't be easily disrupted. Hence going to that stronger worded, if this happens again, we're going to look at disciplinary action. I'm really sorry you're dealing with this. I don't know anyone who thinks that drinking at 9 a.m. is appropriate, certainly not anyone who has a healthy relationship with alcohol. So I wish you all the best for navigating that situation carefully and kindly. So let's jump into our questions, and I will stop sharing so you can see mine and Patrick's lovely faces in full screen. So let me jump in and jump into these pieces here. So Anonymous asks for New Zealand, what if someone is on a zero alcohol license but needs to drive a work vehicle from time to time? I'm not quite sure what a zero alcohol license is. If you've asked this question, it was one of the first that came through. If you wouldn't mind resending it maybe with a bit of detail, then I can help, or you're welcome to grab me afterwards if you'd prefer to do that. Patrick, I'll flip this one to you. What evidence should supervisors be trained to recognise and document to support a decision that a worker is impaired and unfit for duty?
Right. Yeah. Well, that one's actually going to be a little bit easier for yourselves, for instance, because look, when it comes to training, it's really going to fall down to what is the test result, per se, right? It's generally whether or not it's non-negative. And for instance, whether or not there's that impairment factor sort of, with the drug that they've taken. So for instance, of course, ecstasy, cocaine, you name it, right? Obviously, the harder substances. When you see a non-negative and you see that come up as one of the substances, you can pretty much imagine straight away, yes, they are impaired, right? Of course, there are others that won't come up as much. So, for instance, really what all you need to sort of look at is, okay, what is the type of drug that they're taking? Does that cause impairment? And that's really what we need to sort of look out for, right? If we can sort of see, if we can see that they have taken that substance, then we can move straight down the disciplinary path. It enforces, of course, our evidence factor. Because it's going to be serious misconduct, there's a really high threshold. So it's going to be good, for instance, if we do want to terminate or really deal with this in a setting more sort of a harsh precedent to make sure that it's, zero tolerance.
And if this concern came about not because there was a test result in front of you, so say there was some behaviour that was concerning and maybe you don't have a random testing process in place to kind of catch these concerns, what are some of the behaviours you'll be looking out for to get to a reasonable cause test?
Yeah, so the behaviours that you're looking out for are generally, I guess, erratic behaviors, right? Erratic, strange, antisocial behaviors are the ones that we tend to find are the most common. However, they're different for every employee, right? I mean, every person is different in a sense, of course, and they may exhibit different things different ways. So it can be hard to sort of train yourself for a specific thing, right? Where somebody might be very high functioning on something like a substance like ecstasy or for instance crack cocaine. So I guess when it comes down to it, you're looking for the main things such as stumbling, slurring your words, of course, like I said, erratic behaviors, bursting out in anger for over silly things, small things. These are generally the factors that are going to show you, yep, there's something going on, right? But like Sylvie said, if you don't have that policy in place, right? Look, because we're in Australia, right, we can't implement it. On the alternative, right, we could essentially do something called an informal welfare to try and understand and have a frank conversation with the employee around what's happening. We've noticed X, and X behaviors. Is something going on in your personal life that we can assist with? And it essentially puts it back on the employee to see how we can assist with what's going on with them.
Thank you, Patrick. And the next question about ADHD, which is something Patrick and I were talking about before this webinar, funnily enough. So Anonymous asks, we have an employee who has ADHD and who is not medicated. They often look like they are buzzing and erratic in their motions and moods to the outside world. How should this be approached if clients report, hey, your employee's on something? My comment would be to treat this as a behavioural problem, not as a drug and alcohol problem. So as long as you have the client's permission, I would raise this feedback with the employee and say, hey, I need to have a conversation with you. I've had some feedback from one of our customers that I need to cover off. Here's sort of what the customer said. They were a bit alarmed by your behaviour and thought that you might be taking a substance, like you were erratic enough to give them cause for concern. Obviously, we don't want our customers thinking that our employees are taking uppers or are on anything illicit, and whatever the reasons for the behaviour, this behaviour with customers is not okay, and figure out a plan of attack. Is there a way that they can be less customer facing? Do they have tools that they can use in their toolkit, which might not include medication, that mean that they can front to customers in a slightly different way? Can they be supervised or paired with a buddy who can do the customer chat while this particular person goes and cleans the HVAC filter or whatever the issue is? So I would treat it as a behavioural issue. I wouldn't treat it as a drug and alcohol issue. There are plenty of ADHD people for whom medication doesn't work or reasons that they can't take medication. Medication is also not a cure-all, as anyone who's ever tried to titrate their dose and figure out what the right doses are will know. So treat it as a behavioural issue, not as a drug and alcohol one, and see where you get to. Next one for I think this is a New Zealand one, Patrick, around policy, so I'll take this one as well. Changes to existing policies elaborate the step-by-step process for what it means if a non-negative result is achieved. This person asked earlier, we want to make a small change to our drug and alcohol policy. How do we make that change? And so the change they want to make is elaborating the process for what it means if a non-negative result is achieved. So it sounds like the rules of the policy are the same. There will be testing under some circumstances. A non-negative result is not acceptable and there will be consequences, but you just want to make the steps clearer. So I would say draft the new policy, outline the steps that you want to include, send it to your employees to say, hey, everyone, we are making some changes to our drug and alcohol policy to make it clearer what happens, not to change what happens, just to make it clearer. Does anyone have any questions about these inclusions? This policy will go live in 2 weeks. So it's not exactly a consultation, but you are just giving people a heads up that things are different. Hopefully, if the purpose of these changes is to make it clearer, you want to get people's feedback that it is making them clearer, that your changes have achieved what you wanted them to. And then if you do get any questions or feedback, you can work them into your policy there. Cool. So a few more New Zealand questions here, and we're just at time, so I'll give people an opportunity to duck out if you would like to. A quick reminder that the recording for this webinar and the slides will be available afterwards. So if you haven't been able to stick around for questions, or if you would like to revisit this at any point in time, those resources will be there. So thank you for anyone who needs to step away, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one. But we'll go through these next few questions here, and we'll do our best to get them resolved. So Annalise asks, if we don't have a drug and alcohol policy in place for existing employees, how would you suggest we implement the policy and discuss the reasons for this? Great question, Annalise. It depends a little bit on why you're introducing the policy. Are you introducing a policy which says if something goes down, or if we have reasonable cause, or if a customer asks us to, then we will drug and alcohol test you, and here's what happens. I think you just need to say to your team, hey, everyone, we've been made aware that we aren't as clear as we could be in our drug and alcohol policies. We already can do all of these things. We just want to make it really obvious to everyone what's involved, so that if we do have to test following an incident, or if a customer does ask us, there's no surprises in there. So here's what we're proposing. Here's what it would look like. Please review and come back to us with your feedback. If you're introducing a policy that has a broader remit in terms of what it is that you can do, like random testing for safety sensitive roles, then I would really strongly recommend you spend some time kind of fleshing out that story and explaining why you haven't had it up until now and why it makes sense to introduce it. Has your business grown rapidly in the last 2 years? And so you need a few more health and safety tools in place to manage the risks to your business and to your team. Has a really large customer changed their policies, and so you need to have this in place now. Whatever the story is, tell an honest story as much as you can, and then again, as outlined earlier, share the policy with your team, get their feedback, see what they have to say, and then decide on whether you do introduce one or not. Cool. Tony asks, kia ora Tony, thanks for coming along. After a staff function where you've ticked all the boxes, provide transport, etc., when does the liability for the employer stop? Is it once they're home? Great question. Tony, your liability stops once you have seen them safely out of the event. So if you have offered transport from the restaurant to people's homes and people have chosen to carry on partying afterwards and gone to a bar and, gone to Parnell or wherever they're partying, your liability mostly has ended there. You've offered them a way to get home. You have been a responsible host during the party. No one has gotten drunk. No one has gotten intoxicated. There's been no bad behavior. And people have chosen of their own accord to continue partying. It would be no different if a couple of your younger staff on a Friday decided to go out and hit the clubs of their own accord. It's not a work sanctioned activity now. They have chosen to carry on and do something social off their own bat. So as long as you have been a safe host, you have offered them safe ways to get home, kind of that's more or less where your responsibility ends. Cool. Another New Zealand question. This is the zero alcohol license one. So thank you for coming back to me. I appreciate it. So this person's vehicle is fitted with a breathalyzer machine and won't start until they blow zero. And it states on their license it is a zero alcohol license. They obviously have had alcohol issues before, but they need to drive to and from work. What happens if they need to drive a work vehicle from time to time? That is a really excellent question. I would ask how you can mitigate the risks of them drinking and driving in the work vehicle. And if you can't sufficiently manage those risks, I would ask whether there is a way to avoid them having to drive a work vehicle. So one way to manage this would be to say that they have to blow a zero on their own breathalyzer in their own car before they use the company work vehicle. Potentially there could be a conversation with a supervisor or a senior person in the business before they drive their work vehicle to kind of do a visual check and see if they are slurring or if they smell like vodka or if there's any balance concerns. So those interventions would be one way to manage the risk of them driving while intoxicated. If those don't suit for whatever reason, or there kind of isn't any other tools appropriate, I would have a think about if there was a way to avoid them having to drive the work vehicle, and sort of make a plan from there. A bit hard without knowing the circumstances, but you are correct to be alert to the risk of this behavior causing problems driving a work vehicle because of the zero alcohol license, because of the breathalyzer on their car. I would agree that those are signals that there is a heightened risk of alcohol being involved in driving, so responding to that is sensible. How you respond to it kind of depends on your circumstances. So feel free to drop me an email after this webinar if you want to have a bit more of a conversation. We can take it from there. Cool. Couple more coming through, and then I think we will be finished. This one doesn't say New Zealand or Australia. So Patrick, I'll throw to you so that our guests can see you again before we wrap up. Question is, what if the employee has given a non-negative result? During the retest to allow them to return to work, it tested as synthetic, but the employee disagrees with the test results. The sample was tested by 2 different labs and confirmed that there was a synthetic substance. We are proceeding with dismissal. Will there be any issues?
Okay. I guess what we don't have, 100% understanding on whether or not there was any impairment here right now. Whether or not it was synthetic, there are many substances that are synthetic. For instance, lots of medicine, aspirin synthetic, for instance. If that's the case, I mean, we'd sort of need to look at what is it? What is, is the employee impaired? Why are they essentially pushing back, right? What is their argument? There's quite a few, I guess, moving parts that I need to sort of understand to try and give you an understanding of, whether or not there would be any issues. For instance, I'd want to have a look at whether or not there's general protections risk surrounding the employee. Most likely, of course, there is, considering, there is there's been a test that's happened and the employee was unfit for that test. Look, in all honesty, I'd probably want to dive into this one quite a lot deeper.
Yeah, the trick with these scenarios is it always depends on the facts and what's actually happened, and there's
Absolutely.
such a range of things. Well, if Anonymous, if you would like to get some Australian help, please email Patrick at the end of this session, and for New Zealand help, you're welcome to get in touch with me. But those are all our questions. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'll just jump back into our screen share so you can really quickly get mine and Patrick's emails in case that's something that you would like to pick up on. But thank you for coming along. We hope that was useful and you found something interesting in there. To flag again, the slides for this webinar and the recording will be available to you, so you can access them later on. If you'd like to drop me an email, mine on the screen, I'm Sylvie at myhr.works, and Patrick is there, obviously Patrick at myhr.works as well. But otherwise, thank you so much for coming along and for giving us some of your time this afternoon, and I look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Thanks, everyone.